December 17, 1984, a beige Toyota sedan rolls through the wet streets of Alexandria, Virginia, 6 miles south of CIA headquarters. Rain drums on the roof. Inside, a 59-year-old electronics engineer named Arthur Walker Jr. adjusts his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. He's checking for tails. The streetlights reflect off puddles as he turns onto a residential street lined with bare oak trees. His hands are steady on the wheel. He's done this before. In the passenger seat beside him sits a manila envelope containing classified documents he photographed 2 days earlier. Technical specifications for the Mark 48 torpedo fire control system, the most advanced submarine weapons platform in the United States arsenal. Walker pulls into the parking lot of a shuttered strip mall. No one is here. The rain intensifies. He parks under a broken streetlight, leaves the engine running, and waits. 17 minutes later, another car approaches. Walker's heartbeat doesn't quicken. This is routine. He has been passing classified naval intelligence to the Soviet Union for 18 years. The drop happens quickly. Documents change hands. No words. The other car disappears into the rain. Walker drives home, arrives by midnight, kisses his wife, and goes to sleep. He doesn't know that FBI surveillance teams are photographing every movement, that his arrest is scheduled for the following spring, or that when federal agents finally catalog the damage, they will discover he facilitated the transfer of over 1 million pages of classified information representing the technological core of America's submarine warfare capability, propulsion systems, sonar arrays, cryptographic equipment, tactical doctrine, patrol routes, and weapons specifications that allowed Soviet engineers to understand exactly how the United States Navy fought beneath the waves. But Arthur Walker was not the beginning. He was a spoke in a much larger wheel. The real architect of the most devastating espionage network in American naval history was his older brother, John Anthony Walker Jr., a retired Navy communications specialist who ran a spy ring that operated undetected for 18 years and compromised virtually every aspect of U.S. submarine operations during the height of the Cold War. When the ring was finally broken in 1985, the damage assessment revealed something that shook the Pentagon to its foundation. The Soviet Union had been reading encrypted U.S. Navy communications in real time, tracking submarine movements, understanding tactical capabilities, and systematically closing the technological gap that had given America dominance beneath the Arctic ice. This is the story of how Soviet intelligence executed the most successful espionage operation against American naval power in the Cold War era, how they leveraged that intelligence to transform their submarine fleet, and why, despite their success in stealing American secrets, they still couldn't match the systemic superiority that made U.S. submarines the most effective underwater warfare platforms ever deployed. The Atlantic Ocean has always been the great strategic buffer of American power. 3,000 miles of open water separate the United States from potential European adversaries. For the Soviet Union, that ocean represented both opportunity and vulnerability. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet strategic thinking was dominated by a single nightmare scenario: American ballistic missile submarines operating undetected off their coastline, each boat carrying enough nuclear firepower to devastate major cities in minutes. By the early 1960s, the U.S. Navy had operationalized the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile system, creating a survivable second strike capability that could not be neutralized by a Soviet first strike. These submarines were not just weapons platforms. They were the insurance policy of nuclear deterrence, mobile, silent, and virtually undetectable. Soviet naval strategy had to adapt. They couldn't match the geographic advantage. They couldn't replicate the industrial capacity. They couldn't close the technology gap through conventional research and development alone, but they could steal, and they did. The foundation of American submarine superiority rested on 3 pillars: propulsion, stealth, and situational awareness. U.S. submarines were powered by pressurized water reactors that were quieter, more efficient, and more reliable than their Soviet counterparts. They were coated with anechoic tiles that absorbed sonar pulses. Their machinery was mounted on sound-dampening rafts. Their propellers were precisely machined to minimize cavitation. By the 1970s, American attack submarines like the Sturgeon class and Los Angeles class operated at noise levels that made them effectively invisible to Soviet passive sonar at combat ranges. U.S. submariners called it ownership of the ocean. Soviet submariners called it something else: hopeless. Soviet submarines, by contrast, were loud. The Victor I-class attack submarine, introduced in 1967, produced so much acoustic noise that U.S. sonar operators could track it from hundreds of miles away. Soviet reactors ran hotter and noisier than American designs. Their reduction gears whined, their pumps hummed, their hulls resonated with machinery vibration. When a Soviet submarine went to sea, it announced its presence to every hydrophone array in the Atlantic. American submariners joked that they could hear a Victor-class boat leaving port before it even submerged. This acoustic disadvantage was not a matter of engineering incompetence. Soviet submarine designers understood the principles of quieting. They had access to theoretical research. They had skilled metallurgists and hydrodynamicists. What they lacked was the industrial ecosystem to implement that knowledge at scale. American manufacturing could produce precisely machined propellers with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Soviet factories could not. American metallurgy could create specialized alloys for reactor components that minimized thermal expansion and vibration. Soviet supply chains could not deliver those materials consistently. The gap was systemic, not intellectual. But intelligence could bridge part of that gap. You didn't need to build a better factory if you could steal the blueprints. You didn't need to develop original sonar technology if you could acquire working specifications. You didn't need to conduct years of operational testing if you could read your adversary's patrol reports. This was the logic that drove Soviet intelligence collection against the US Navy throughout the Cold War. And in John Walker they found the perfect asset. John Anthony Walker Jr. was born in 1937 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and joined the Navy in 19... By the standards of the enlisted ranks, he was intelligent and technically competent, though not exceptional. He advanced steadily through the communications rating, handling encrypted message traffic aboard destroyers and shore stations. In 1967, he was assigned to the staff of Submarine Force Atlantic Headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, where he served as a watch officer and communications specialist with a top-secret crypto clearance. This clearance gave him access to the heart of American naval operations, the cryptographic key material used to encrypt and decrypt classified message traffic across the entire Atlantic submarine fleet. Modern naval warfare depends on secure communications. Submarines at sea receive orders, intelligence updates, and targeting data through encrypted radio transmissions. The encryption systems used by the US Navy in the 1960s and 1970s were considered virtually unbreakable. Soviet cryptanalysts had tried for decades to crack American naval codes and failed. The mathematics were sound. The key management was rigorous. The systems were theoretically secure. But theoretical security assumes that the enemy doesn't have the keys. John Walker had the keys. All of them. In December 1967, facing financial problems from a failing bar business and mounting debts, Walker walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and offered his services to the KGB. He brought with him a sampling of the classified material he could provide, copies of current cryptographic key lists for US Navy communications systems. For Soviet intelligence, this was a gift beyond measure. With those key lists, they could decrypt every classified transmission sent by US naval forces worldwide. They could read the operational orders. They could track submarine movements. They could understand tactical procedures. They could see inside the American system in real time. The KGB officers who met Walker that December understood immediately what they had. This was not a marginal source providing fragmentary insights. This was comprehensive, systematic penetration of American naval communications at the strategic level. They paid him handsomely, several $1,000s for the initial delivery, with promises of regular payments for continued access. Walker left the embassy that day as an active Soviet agent, and for the next 18 years, he delivered a continuous stream of classified material that gave Soviet naval intelligence a transparency into US submarine operations that would have been impossible through any other means. Walker's access was extraordinary, but he understood that he couldn't maintain it indefinitely. Promotions, transfers, and routine security procedures would eventually move him away from direct handling of cryptographic material. So he recruited. His first recruit was his best friend and fellow communications specialist, Senior Chief Radioman Jerry Whitworth, who joined the Navy submarine service and eventually served aboard the carrier USS Enterprise and the attack submarine USS Niagara Falls. Whitworth had continuous access to crypto material throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, and he photographed everything: key lists, technical manuals, maintenance procedures, communication schedules. In 1980, Navy investigators would later conclude Whitworth alone compromised enough classified information to fill a large moving van. Walker recruited his own son, Michael Walker, who joined the Navy and served aboard the attack submarine USS Nimitz, and later worked as a yeoman with access to classified documents. He recruited his brother, Arthur Walker, who worked as a civilian contractor for VSE Corporation and had access to classified naval engineering specifications. Between 1968 and 1985, the Walker spy ring operated continuously, delivering cryptographic keys, operational plans, technical manuals, and strategic assessments directly into the hands of Soviet naval intelligence. The material they provided was staggering in scope. cryptographic key lists for the KW7, KG14, and KY8 encryption systems, technical specifications for the AN/BQQ5 sonar suite used on Los Angeles-class submarines, operating manuals for the Mark 48 torpedo fire control system, patrol routes and operating areas for ballistic missile submarines, intelligence assessments of Soviet submarine capabilities, tactical doctrine for anti-submarine warfare, communication procedures for coordinating with NATO allies. The Walker Ring didn't just compromise individual systems, they compromised the entire operational framework of American submarine warfare. March 3, 1976. The Northern Fleet headquarters in Severomorsk above the Arctic Circle. A conference room on the third floor of the main intelligence building, windows facing the grey waters of the Kola Bay. Captain First Rank Victor Daigalo sits at a table covered with decrypted US Navy message traffic. He is 42 years old, a career submariner and intelligence officer who has spent the last decade trying to understand how American submarines operate. In front of him are documents that should not exist. Complete texts of classified operational orders sent to the USS Grayling, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine currently on patrol in the Barents Sea. The orders specify the boat's patrol box, depth parameters, communication schedule, and rules of engagement for shadowing Soviet submarines. Daigalo reads them 3 times. The implications are overwhelming. The Soviet Navy isn't just intercepting encrypted American communications, they're reading them, in real time. For years, Soviet naval intelligence relied on traffic analysis, direction finding, and educated guesses about American submarine movements. Now they have certainty. They know where the boats are. They know what they're doing. They know what their commanders are telling them. Daigalo stands and walks to the window. Outside, a Victor II-class submarine is preparing to sortie, its crew moving across the deck in the pale Arctic light. That submarine will operate with an advantage Soviet boats have never had. They'll know exactly where the Americans are hunting. The intelligence windfall from the Walker Ring transformed Soviet naval operations throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. For the first time, Soviet commanders could correlate their own tactical observations with actual American intentions. When a Soviet submarine detected suspicious sonar contacts, they could check decrypted message traffic to confirm whether US attacks. When Soviet surface groups conducted exercises, they could verify whether American intelligence gathering submarines were monitoring them. The fog of war lifted, at least partially, and Soviet naval forces operated with a level of situational awareness they had never possessed before. But intelligence about American capabilities was only half the equation. The other half was building submarines that could exploit that intelligence. Knowing where an American submarine was patrolling didn't matter if you couldn't get close enough to track it. Knowing American tactical doctrine didn't matter if your own boats were too loud to survive close-range encounters. Soviet naval engineers understood this clearly. They needed quieter submarines. And thanks to the Walker Ring, they began to understand exactly how the Americans achieved silence. Among the documents compromised by the spy ring were technical specifications and operational assessments of US submarine quieting technology. These included descriptions of anechoic hull coatings, machinery mounting systems, propeller design principles, and reactor pump configurations. For Soviet engineers, this was invaluable data. They didn't receive complete blueprints. Walker and his associates couldn't access detailed engineering drawings, but they received enough performance specifications and operational descriptions to understand what worked and why. Soviet submarine designers had been experimenting with quieting techniques throughout the 1970s, but their efforts were hindered by limited feedback on what actually worked in operational conditions. Anechoic coatings were notoriously difficult to optimize. Different rubber compositions, tile configurations, and mounting systems produced vastly different results, and testing those variations required expensive sea trials. Machinery isolation systems required precise engineering tolerances that Soviet manufacturing struggled to achieve. Propeller design involved complex hydrodynamics that was hard to verify without extensive acoustic testing. The intelligence from the Walker Ring didn't solve these manufacturing problems, but it told Soviet engineers where to focus their efforts. They could see which approaches worked and which didn't. They could prioritize development programs based on proven American solutions rather than theoretical possibilities. The result was the Victor III-class attack submarine, introduced in 1978. This was the first Soviet submarine design to incorporate comprehensive quieting measures based partly on intelligence insights into American techniques. The Victor III featured an anechoic coating covering much of the hull, machinery mounted on sound-dampening rafts, improved propeller design, and redesigned reactor cooling systems. When the first Victor III boats entered service, American sonar operators noticed something unsettling. They were quieter, significantly quieter, not as quiet as American boats. The Los Angeles-class submarines still maintained a substantial acoustic advantage, but quiet enough to complicate detection at longer ranges. The Victor THE represented a quantum leap in Soviet submarine technology, reducing acoustic signatures by an estimated 15 to 20 decibels compared to earlier Victor-class boats. In sonar terms, that difference was profound. A reduction of 20 decibels meant that detection range was cut by more than half. A Victor 1 that could be detected at 200 miles might now be detected at 80. The ocean was getting smaller, and Soviet submarines were learning how to hide. August 15, 19. The Norwegian Sea, approximately 300 miles west of Trondheim. The USS Dallas, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, is conducting a surveillance patrol. The boat is running at 400 feet, making 5 knots, configured for ultra-quiet operations. In the sonar shack, sonar technician second class Robert Hansen sits at the ANBQQ-5 console, monitoring the ocean through headphones that feed him processed acoustic data from the towed array hydrophone system stretching behind the submarine. For the past 6 hours, the ocean has been mostly empty, biologics, distant merchant traffic, nothing tactically interesting. Then he hears something. It's faint. A tonal contact on a narrow frequency band, bearing 035 degrees relative. Hansen adjusts the gain, narrows the filter, and listens again. The tonal is irregular, cycling in intensity. It's machinery noise, but it doesn't match any known Soviet submarine signature in the recognition manual. He marks it, logs it, and alerts the officer of the deck. The Dallas adjusts course to close the contact. Over the next hour, Hansen builds a more complete acoustic picture. The contact is definitely a submarine, probably Soviet, but it's quieter than any Soviet boat he's tracked before. The usual broadband noise is suppressed. The tonals are muted. If he hadn't caught that initial frequency spike, they might have missed it entirely. Lieutenant Commander David Poole, the Dallas's executive officer, reviews the sonar data in the control room. He's a veteran submariner with 10 years of anti-submarine warfare experience, and he knows Soviet submarine signatures like he knows his own crew. This contact doesn't fit the pattern. It's too quiet, too controlled. He orders the boat to close further, maneuvering carefully to avoid alerting the contact. Over the next 12 hours, the Dallas shadows the Soviet submarine, later identified as a Victor III, from varying ranges and aspects, recording acoustic data for intelligence analysis. When the Dallas returns to port 3 weeks later, the sonar tapes are rushed to the Office of Naval Intelligence for evaluation. The analysts are troubled. The Victor III represents a significant capability improvement. It's not a peer to American submarines. The Los Angeles class still maintains a decisive acoustic advantage, but it's closing the gap in ways that complicate operational planning. If Soviet submarines can reduce their noise signatures by another 10 decibels, they'll be difficult to detect at tactically useful ranges. If they reduce it by 20, they'll achieve effective parity in some acoustic environments. The fundamental assumption of American submarine warfare, that US boats can detect Soviet submarines long before being detected themselves, is beginning to erode. What the analysts at the Office of Naval Intelligence don't know is that the Victor III's quieting improvements are partly the result of intelligence derived from John Walker's deliveries. They don't know that Soviet engineers have been reading technical assessments of American quieting technology. They don't know that the KGB has been systematically collecting specifications, performance data, and operational observations that allow Soviet designers to understand exactly how much acoustic superiority American submarines possess, and how they achieve it. The intelligence community suspects that the Soviets have made breakthroughs in submarine quieting, but they assume it's the result of indigenous research and development. The possibility that it might be driven by comprehensive espionage against the US Navy doesn't occur to them. Not yet. But the evidence is accumulating. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, American submarines and surface ships begin detecting Soviet submarines in locations they shouldn't be. Soviet attack submarines appear in patrol areas where US ballistic missile submarines operate, as if they know exactly where to search. Soviet intelligence-gathering ships show up near planned NATO exercises before the exercises are officially announced. Soviet naval forces demonstrate tactical awareness that suggests they're reading American communications in real time. The pattern is there, but connecting the pieces requires an investigative breakthrough that won't come until 1985. May 20, 1985, a small FBI field office in Rockville, Maryland. Special Agent Robert Hunter sits across from Barbara Walker, the ex-wife of John Walker. She is 53 years old, chain-smoking, angry, and about to detonate the most significant naval espionage case in American history. She has known for years that her ex-husband was a Soviet spy. He told her about it during their marriage, bragged about the money, explained how he photographed classified documents. After their divorce in 1976, she stayed silent, out of fear, out of lingering loyalty, out of a desire to protect her children. But now she's broke, bitter, and convinced that John Walker is living comfortably on money he earned, betraying his country while she struggles to pay rent. So she called the FBI and asked to speak to someone about a spy. Hunter listens carefully as Barbara Walker describes 18 years of espionage. Her story sounds implausible at first, too detailed, too comprehensive, too damaging to be true. But she provides specifics, dates, locations, methods, names of other participants. She describes how Walker photographed classified documents, how he met his Soviet handlers, how he recruited his own son. Hunter takes notes, asks clarifying questions, and within an hour, he understands that this is real. If Barbara Walker is telling the truth, the US Navy has been hemorrhaging classified information to the Soviet Union for nearly 2 decades. The FBI investigation moves quickly. Surveillance teams are established, financial records are subpoenaed, interviews are conducted with Navy personnel who worked with Walker and his associates. The evidence mounts rapidly. On May 19, 1985, FBI agents arrest John Walker after he services a dead drop in Maryland. In his car, they find classified documents he was preparing to pass to his Soviet handlers. Over the next few weeks, the rest of the ring is rolled up: Arthur Walker, Michael Walker, and Jerry Whitworth. The scale of the compromise becomes clear through interrogations and document analysis. The damage assessment takes months. Navy counterintelligence specialists, FBI investigators, and cryptographic experts work through the list of compromised material. Cryptographic key lists for dozens of encryption systems. Technical manuals for submarine sonar, weapons and propulsion systems. Operational orders and patrol reports. Intelligence assessments of Soviet naval capabilities. Strategic planning documents. Communication protocols. The list grows longer every day. By the time the assessment is complete, investigators conclude that the Walker spy ring compromised more than 1 million pages of classified documents and gave the Soviet Union access to encrypted US Navy communications for the entire period of Walker's operation. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger calls it one of the most damaging espionage cases in the history of the United States. Admiral James Watkins, Chief of Naval Operations, is more specific. The Walker ring allowed the Soviet Navy to read our mail for 18 years. They knew where our submarines were, what they were doing, and how they operated. The damage to national security is incalculable. But the most chilling assessment comes from a Soviet defector, KGB officer Vitaly Yurchenko, who defects to the United States in August 19. In debriefings, Yurchenko confirms what American investigators suspected. The intelligence from the Walker ring was considered a strategic asset of the highest importance by Soviet military intelligence. It had influenced Soviet naval planning, submarine design, and operational doctrine. It had given Soviet forces a transparency into American capabilities that they could not have achieved through any other means. According to Yurchenko, Soviet naval commanders considered the Walker intelligence priceless because it allowed them to understand not just what American submarines could do, but what American submariners believed Soviet submarines could do. That meta-knowledge, understanding the American perception of Soviet capabilities, allowed Soviet forces to exploit blind spots and misconceptions. The question that haunts the post-Walker damage assessment is this: if Soviet intelligence had comprehensive access to American submarine technology, operational doctrine, and tactical communications for 18 years, why didn't the Soviet Union achieve parity? Why didn't they close the gap? Why did American submarines maintain acoustic and operational superiority throughout the 1980s despite the massive intelligence compromise? The answer reveals the fundamental difference between intelligence and capability, between knowledge and execution, between understanding a system and replicating it. Soviet engineers knew what American submarines could do. They understood the principles of quieting technology. They had specifications for sonar systems, propeller designs, reactor configurations, and anechoic coatings. What they didn't have, what intelligence couldn't provide, was the industrial ecosystem to implement that knowledge at scale. American submarine manufacturing was built on layers of specialized capability developed over decades. The propellers for Los Angeles-class submarines were machined to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch using precision tools that Soviet factories didn't possess. The anechoic tiles that absorbed sonar pulses required rubber compounds with specific acoustic properties that Soviet chemical industries couldn't consistently produce. The reduction gears that transferred power from the reactor to the propeller shaft required specialized alloys and heat treatments that Soviet metallurgy struggled to replicate. The quality control processes that ensured every component met specifications required testing equipment and inspection protocols that Soviet manufacturing lacked. This wasn't a matter of intelligence or theoretical knowledge. Soviet scientists understood the physics. Soviet engineers understood the principles. What they didn't have was the industrial base to turn that understanding into operational capability at production scale. You can't steal an industrial ecosystem. You can't photograph a factory's institutional knowledge. You can't copy the accumulated expertise of thousands of technicians, machinists, and quality control inspectors who understand how to build complex systems reliably. The Akula-class submarine, introduced in 1984, represented the peak of Soviet submarine quieting technology during the Cold War. It incorporated advanced anechoic coatings, sophisticated machinery mounting systems, improved propellers, and highly refined reactor designs. American sonar operators who first encountered Akula-class boats noted that they were significantly quieter than any previous Soviet submarine, quiet enough in some acoustic conditions to approach parity with earlier American designs like the Sturgeon class. This was a genuine achievement of Soviet engineering, reflecting years of focused development and the benefits of intelligence insights into American quieting techniques. But the Akula was not as quiet as the Los Angeles-class submarine, and it was nowhere close to the Seawolf-class submarines then under development. The fundamental acoustic advantage remained with the United States. More importantly, the Akula was difficult and expensive to build. Soviet factories struggled to produce the precision components at the required quality levels. Production was slow, reliability was questionable. Many of the first Akula boats spent more time in maintenance than at sea because their complex systems exceeded the maintenance capabilities of Soviet naval infrastructure. American submarines, by contrast, were built in quantity, maintained reliably, and operated continuously. The Los Angeles-class production run totaled 62 boats, making it the largest class of nuclear submarines ever built. Each boat was constructed with components sourced from a mature industrial supply chain that could deliver precision parts on schedule. Each boat could be maintained by a naval support infrastructure that understood the technology thoroughly. Each boat operated with a crew trained on sophisticated simulators and supported by a logistics system that kept them at sea for extended deployments. This was systemic capability, not dependent on individual genius or heroic effort, but on institutional competence replicated across the entire submarine force. The Walker Ring gave Soviet intelligence a window into American capability, but it couldn't transfer the system that created that capability. It couldn't copy the decades of accumulated manufacturing expertise. It couldn't replicate the culture of engineering rigor and quality control. It couldn't transfer the institutional knowledge that made American submarine operations effective. October 9th, Naval Submarine Base, New London, Groton, Connecticut. The USS Alexandria, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, returns from a 6-month deployment in the North Atlantic. The boat surfaces in the Thames River on a grey autumn morning, the American flag snapping in the wind above the sail. As the crew secures the boat to the pier, Commander Paul Whitmer, the Alexandria's commanding officer, walks down the brow carrying a classified report he'll deliver to Submarine Force headquarters within the hour. The report details a close-range encounter with an Akula-class submarine off the coast of Norway, including acoustic recordings and tactical observations. Whitmer is not celebrating. The encounter was professionally unsettling. The Akula was quieter than any Soviet boat he'd tracked before. It demonstrated sophisticated evasion tactics and maintained acoustic discipline throughout the encounter. It was, in his assessment, a capable platform operated by a skilled crew, but his boat still detected it first. His sonar team tracked it continuously. His crew maneuvered around it without being detected. The Alexandria maintained tactical superiority throughout the encounter, not because American submariners were inherently superior to their Soviet counterparts, but because their boat was quieter, their sensors were more capable, and their training was more comprehensive. This is the reality that the Walker spy ring couldn't change. Soviet intelligence gained unprecedented access to American technology and operational doctrine, but access to knowledge isn't the same as the ability to execute. The American submarine force maintained superiority because it was built on systemic advantages, industrial capacity, engineering quality, institutional competence that couldn't be stolen. The Walker prosecutions moved through the courts through 1986 and 1987. John Walker was convicted of espionage and sentenced to life in prison. Arthur Walker received 3 life sentences plus 40 years. Michael Walker received 25 years. Jerry Whitworth was convicted after a lengthy trial and sentenced to 365 years in prison. The sentences reflected the severity of the damage and the betrayal of trust. These men had compromised the security of thousands of American submariners who operated in hostile waters, trusting that their communications were secure and their tactical advantages were intact. But the prosecutions didn't erase the damage. The Navy had to assume that every communication system compromised by the Walker Ring was known to Soviet intelligence. Cryptographic systems were replaced, operational procedures were rewritten, patrol routes were changed. The cost of re-establishing secure communications across the entire fleet ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. The strategic uncertainty, wondering what else the Soviets knew, what other vulnerabilities existed, lasted for years. The Walker case prompted a fundamental reassessment of Navy security procedures. How had one man maintained access to classified communications for 18 years without triggering security reviews? How had a spy ring operated undetected, despite multiple warning signs? How had the system failed so completely? The answers were uncomfortable. Security clearances weren't reviewed frequently enough, financial problems weren't investigated thoroughly, personnel with access to classified material weren't monitored adequately, and the assumption that enlisted personnel couldn't cause strategic damage was dangerously naive. New security protocols were implemented across the Department of Defense. Background investigations became more thorough. Financial reviews became mandatory. Access to classified material was restricted and audited more carefully. The concept of need to know was enforced more rigorously. Security awareness training was expanded. Counterintelligence resources were increased. The reforms didn't make espionage impossible. No security system is perfect, but they made it harder, riskier, and less likely to remain undetected for extended periods. The strategic lesson of the Walker spy ring is this: intelligence is powerful, but it's not decisive. Knowing your adversary's capabilities matters. Understanding their doctrine, technology, and tactics provides advantages that can be operationally significant. But intelligence can't overcome systemic inferiority. It can't transform a weaker industrial base into a stronger one. It can't replace institutional competence with stolen blueprints. It can't turn fragmented knowledge into integrated capability. Soviet submarine forces benefited enormously from the intelligence provided by the Walker Ring. They understood American capabilities more clearly. They operated with greater situational awareness. They developed quieting technologies informed by knowledge of what worked. But they didn't achieve parity. They didn't close the gap decisively. And when the Cold War ended, the US submarine force remained the most capable underwater warfare force in the world, not because Soviet intelligence failed to collect information, but because American superiority was built on foundations that couldn't be stolen. The human cost of the Walker spy ring is harder to quantify. No American submariners died directly because of the compromised intelligence. There were no ambushes, no attacks, no catastrophic operational failures that can be traced directly to the espionage. But thousands of American sailors operated in hostile waters throughout the 1970s, believing their communications were secure, believing their tactical advantages were intact, believing that their missions were protected by secrecy that didn't exist. They took calculated risks based on assumptions that were false. They trusted that their country's security systems would protect them. That trust was betrayed by men who chose money over loyalty, who traded national security for personal gain, who saw no moral distinction between serving their country and selling its secrets. John Walker showed no remorse during his trial or in subsequent interviews. He described espionage as a business and said he felt no guilt about compromising American security. Arthur Walker claimed he needed the money and didn't understand the significance of the documents he photographed. Jerry Whitworth argued that he was just following orders and didn't believe he was causing real damage. Michael Walker said he was pressured by his father and didn't realize the consequences. These are the justifications of men who fundamentally failed to understand what they were protecting and what they destroyed. November 12, 1989, Berlin. The wall comes down. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet satellite states begin their collapse. In the Soviet Union itself, economic stagnation, political reform, and the accumulated weight of decades of systemic inefficiency are pushing the system toward dissolution. By December 1991, the Soviet Union will cease to exist. The Cold War will be over. The contest between two competing systems will be decided not by military confrontation, but by the simple reality that one system could sustain itself and the other couldn't. In Severomorsk, above the Arctic Circle, the Northern Fleet submarine base prepares for winter. A Victor III-class submarine sits pierside, waiting for maintenance that will be delayed because spare parts haven't arrived. An Akula-class boat is in dry dock. Its reactor offline because qualified technicians are leaving the Navy for better-paying civilian jobs. The infrastructure is decaying. The supply system is failing. The institutional competence that kept Soviet submarines at sea is dissolving as the economic system that supported it collapses. The irony is profound. Soviet intelligence had collected comprehensive information about American submarine technology for 2 decades. They understood how American boats operated, how they were built, what made them superior. That knowledge helped Soviet engineers improve their own designs and narrow the capability gap. But it couldn't save the system. Intelligence couldn't overcome economic stagnation. Espionage couldn't replace industrial capacity. Stolen secrets couldn't substitute for systemic competence. The American submarine force, by contrast, continued operations without interruption. New boats were commissioned. Existing boats were maintained and upgraded. Crews were trained on advanced simulators. The industrial base that supported submarine construction remained intact and productive. The technological edge that existed in 1968 when John Walker first approached the Soviet embassy was maintained and expanded throughout the 1980s and into the post-Cold War era. The Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines introduced in the early 1980s remain in service today, still the most capable strategic deterrent platforms in the world. The Seawolf and Virginia-class attack submarines represent evolutionary improvements on the Los Angeles class, incorporating advanced technology but built on the same foundation of industrial capability and institutional expertise. This is the ultimate verdict on the Walker spy ring. They caused enormous damage, compromised critical security, and gave Soviet intelligence unprecedented access to American naval secrets. But they didn't change the outcome. They couldn't, because the Cold War wasn't decided by who had the best intelligence. It was decided by who had the better system. And on that fundamental question, espionage was irrelevant. The Walker case remains a cautionary tale in the intelligence community. It's studied by counterintelligence professionals as an example of how insider threats can persist undetected when security systems are inadequate. It's examined by naval historians as a case study in the relationship between intelligence and capability. It's analyzed by technology experts as a demonstration of why systemic superiority matters more than individual advantage. And it's remembered by submariners who served during the Cold War as a betrayal by men who were trusted with their lives. The cryptographic keys that John Walker delivered to the KGB are obsolete now, replaced decades ago by more sophisticated encryption systems. The submarine technologies that Arthur Walker photographed are antiquated, superseded by multiple generations of improved capability. The tactical doctrine that Jerry Whitworth compromised has been revised countless times based on changed threats and new technologies. The specific intelligence collected by the Walker ring is no longer relevant. But the lesson is timeless. Intelligence is not capability, knowledge is not power, and access to secrets doesn't guarantee success. The Soviet submarine force that benefited from the Walker ring no longer exists. The Northern Fleet still operates now under the Russian flag, but with a fraction of the boats, maintenance capacity, and operational tempo that existed during the Cold War. The Akula-class submarines that represented the peak of Soviet quieting technology are mostly retired or in reserve. The industrial base that built them has contracted dramatically. The institutional expertise that supported their operations has dispersed. The system that consumed American intelligence for decades but couldn't transform it into decisive advantage has collapsed, leaving behind a fleet that is numerically smaller, technologically dated, and operationally limited compared to its Cold War predecessor. The American submarine force, meanwhile, continues to dominate underwater warfare. The current generation of Virginia-class attack submarines are quieter, more capable, and more versatile than any submarines in history. They incorporate advanced sensors, sophisticated sonar processing, network-centric warfare capabilities, and propulsion systems that approach the theoretical limits of nuclear reactor efficiency. They're built in American shipyards using components manufactured by a supply chain that has been refining submarine construction for over 60 years. They're maintained by a naval infrastructure that understands their technology completely. They're operated by crews trained to standards that emphasize technical competence, tactical proficiency, and operational reliability. This continuity of excellence is the real story of American submarine warfare, not the dramatic intelligence compromises, not the technological breakthroughs, but the sustained systemic superiority that allowed one nation to build and operate effective submarines consistently across decades, while their adversaries struggled to match that capability despite unprecedented access to secret information. If you're watching this documentary because you're interested in how intelligence actually works in great power competition, consider this. The Walker spy ring succeeded completely in its mission. It collected vast amounts of classified information. It delivered that intelligence to Soviet handlers for 18 years. It compromised critical American security at the strategic level. By any measure of espionage tradecraft, it was successful, and yet it didn't change the outcome. Soviet submarines didn't achieve parity. Soviet naval forces didn't negate American advantages. The intelligence windfall didn't translate into operational superiority, because intelligence alone can't overcome systemic disadvantage. This documentary has focused on one of the most successful espionage operations in Cold War history. But the larger story is about the limits of espionage in determining strategic outcomes. Soviet intelligence was effective throughout the Cold War. They had numerous successful operations beyond the Walker Ring. They collected comprehensive information about American military capabilities, economic strength, and political decision-making. They knew what the United States could do, how American leaders thought, and what advantages America possessed. But that knowledge didn't save their system because the Cold War wasn't a contest about who knew more. It was a contest about who could build more, produce better, sustain longer, and adapt faster. And on those dimensions, intelligence was just one input among many. The Walker Ring gave Soviet submarine forces a window into American capabilities that they used effectively to improve their own designs and operations. But they couldn't replicate the industrial base that made American submarines superior. They couldn't copy the institutional culture that made American submariners effective. They couldn't steal the systemic advantages that allowed the US Navy to build 62 Los Angeles-class submarines while Soviet factories struggled to produce a fraction of that number. Intelligence provided insight, but it couldn't overcome reality. Think about what this documentary has shown you. Years of espionage, millions of pages of classified documents, comprehensive penetration of American naval security, and the result was marginal improvement in Soviet submarine capability that didn't fundamentally change the balance of power. The Walker Ring was a success as an intelligence operation and a failure as a strategic game-changer. That's the paradox of espionage in great power competition. It matters. It influences decisions. It shapes outcomes at the margins, but it rarely determines the final score, because the final score is determined by systemic capability, not secret knowledge. If this perspective on Cold War intelligence operations interests you, subscribe to this channel. We examine these stories not to celebrate American technology or denigrate Soviet efforts, but to understand what actually determined outcomes in the most significant geopolitical contest of the 20th century. The answer is usually more complex, more systemic, and more human than simple narratives about technology or intelligence suggest. Join us as we continue exploring these stories, and consider sharing this documentary with anyone interested in how great powers compete, how intelligence actually works, and why some systems prevail while others fail despite access to their adversaries' secrets.